Hello, everyone. Linker here with the AFKArena podcast featuring the people that make the community what it is. And today's guest has a very interesting meta to talk about. Will you please introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Aimb or Aim or Aimb. You can call me whatever the hell you want. Yeah, so I'm a member of Cloud9. I help with some of the strats for AE, and I've made some guides on Reddit. Particularly, the first one was an AE, and then, of course, a lot of people know me as an eyes old guy. It wasn't the first, won't be the last.
All right. And in my mind, I always think of you as this meta conspiracy theorist. Like, you have some awesome replays we'll talk about. You guys can see some of this on screen. And I think you're also one of the first who came up with the idea of 4-faction meta. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is it the absolute first, or was it something you kind of adopted with a couple other people?
So I wasn't the first one to play 4-faction heroes, obviously. What I had is a unique perspective that came from creating two different accounts. The first one, I avoided going for Celopogians. That's mainly because in other games I've played, I've tried to break the meta almost by default. Not necessarily because metas are bad, but because people have blind spots and metas become stale, and I have fun doing that kind of thing. So my first account, which was going to be my only account, was set up, artificially holding back to 4-faction. Not because I thought it was good or anything like that. Then, as I got incredibly lucky on an alt that was supposed to be free to play. Long story short, it is not free to play anymore, and instead, Celopogian account. So anyway, the perspective that I gained from this was when the swap happened to a furniture. All of a sudden, I was able to compare the two accounts, and I realized very quickly that there was no real power difference gained by having really strong Celopogians while they were slightly underdeveloped. And so just from that, I was able to glean the idea of 4-faction being a possible meta as an alternate way of investing.
All right, and as some of the viewers in the channel know, this is not completely consensus. Personally, I'm a guy who really advocates stargazing for those, but I definitely get the fun part of breaking the meta and finding some stuff. And I definitely see a lot of F2P players break up very forward in campaign, adopting this idea that maybe stargazing isn't the end-all be-all. There's also been some recent changes, but just for some of the viewers that are not aware, why don't you go ahead and explain what is 4-faction? What's the idea behind it?
Sure, and all it really is finding out that Celopogians, if you're stargazing for them for diamonds, are incredibly expensive. And all 4-faction meta is just a focus on investing on the main 4-faction heroes and creating teams out of that can be content until some inflection point, at which point you do pick up stargazing with diamonds for Celopogians.
So you've also discovered some heroes people previously disregarded. Is that right? Like, I know you really like Isold, and I'm wondering, like, is there any other heroes that people are kind of sleeping on that you found out while experimenting?
So I would say that no one is, at this point, is sleeping on any particular hero, largely because you have creative players like, Shay, Whip, Goody, and everything's kind of being tested now. So I'm not sure that anything's truly being slept on. Rather, Cassos, for instance, I guess I'd say I found a decent use for him on a 5-pull Flora team. So, there's some unique heroes or some unique uses for heroes, but I would say that nothing's really being hard slept on anymore that I see.
So no specific hero. We'll actually talk about those cores that you found later. I think this is really interesting stuff. But let's first talk about one of those replays. For example, I pulled up the Cassos replay that you have, that you sent me before to prepare for this. And I want you to just kind of walk me through what's happening on here. Because most people, they see Aaron, they're like, all right, so Aaron's the carry. And all of a sudden, Aaron's doing no damage. So what's going on? What am I seeing?
And so as a lot of people know from 5-pull, Aaron or Iron, however you pronounce it, commonly just dies outright after pulling. And this comp isn't about saving him so much as the synergy between Flora, Cassos, and grouping 5 enemies in Sophia's zone. What the 5 group does is it makes sure that Flora's birds are always sent to deal damage to 5 heroes, and also shields 3 slots 1, 2, and 4. With Cassos' life leech times the 5 damage, basically always keeps her health capped, which reduces the cooldown on her birds. So she's spamming shields and lots of damage. That's the basic core of it. And Cassos is made tanky by Flora because he gets 22% damage reduction for each backline hero alive. And she's in backline and can't die until he does, or can't come down and die until he does.
Oh, that's awesome. So the idea here, if I'm getting this right, let me unpack this. Casa stays alive because he has the buff whenever every backline hero is alive. He gets the 22%. Is that right? 22% to mitigation? Or 20?
For each.
Yeah, so 22 for each ally in the backline that's alive. Usually you do the 5 pull, and then Aaron and probably Saphira, from what I see, instantly die. But he stays alive, and the reason he stays alive is both because of his innate tankiness and the fact that he buffs critical ratings and allows Flora to life leech. So because Flora is managing to life leech, she stays above the health threshold of her ability that allows her to keep spamming those birds. And every time she spams the birds, she gives another shield to Cassus that stays alive. So essentially, all enemies are grouped up. You give those shields prominently, and Cassus and whoever is in the front line with them get to stay alive for a long time.
Exactly.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I don't see that used a lot. I think actually some, like most viewers wouldn't guess Cassus is actually that viable. And now they recently also changed his 9. Did you see that?
They changed his
Furniture bonus, the 9.
Oh, no, actually, I haven't seen that.
Oh, yeah, they did, because what it used to be.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cassos. I'm looking at Korea. Yes. Yeah, yes. So I actually have a ticket in right now because I'm not sure that his 9 of 9 actually works. But what's good news is now people can get 3 of 3 and effectively make the same team.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I also see Korea lived really, really long time there. So that's those shields coming down from Flora?
Exactly. And actually in this one, Cassos died and there were still 3 heroes up, and even Skriath was able to tank them. And those are, heavy damage enemies in that group.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing Celise, I'm seeing Glorison debuffing and all of that. That's really, really impressive. What kind of team do you feel like this kind of team would be good into? Or better than, let's say, just a typical Aaron 5 pool?
So the good news is it's good against most teams. The one that it struggles the most against, I would say, is probably Rosa, just because her sweep can not just kill Iron, but also can deal damage around. And it's kind of random, like which direction she's pulled from, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it just struggles a little bit occasionally. And sometimes it doesn't care. If she's targeting Cassos, usually he's tanky enough to live through most of it.
All right. So basically, there's just more than one way to use, for example, Aaron, who people classically use as a carry. It's really interesting. Also, another thing is that I see a lot of more people getting aware of those different viable heroes through the new mods. Like, for example, you see Battle of Blood. We had this tournament thing. We talked about you with that. I heard that you were decently successful at that. Do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So I ended in 32nd place.
32nd.
And
global?
And global. The key to that was knowing when to stop. I think Artie said that. Basically, by the end, I think I was 70th. I got my way up into the 30s. I think I was 38. And I was on a hot streak and decided not to play. And I mean, it was on the back of really good RNG. Everyone knows how Battle of Blood works. It's feast or famine. And the decision was, why lose the next one and then spend that series trying to make that up, probably plummeting down to 1800s. So Battle of Blood is a lot of fun. It does need some tweaks, which I know has been talked about on this podcast before.
I see. Well, how would you tweak it, though? Would you do a ban system? What do you feel like is right?
I feel like just so long as both players have equal number of Celopogian and Dimensionals, then the RNG's fine, right? You can get much better ones, but that's the case no matter what you do. It can still be random how many you get, just as long as it's equal.
One issue I've had with that system, though, is that even the Celopogians are not all equal. So I don't know, like if I get a Wukong and the enemy gets an Ainz, I'm feeling a little bit bad. Still, even though I have a Wukong, I'm not 100% confident.
I'll take that matchup. Well, yeah. So I agree that it's going to be RNG in the end, and there are some heroes that you can get that the ban system would be better to completely remove. But you'd also run into never seeing those heroes because there would be consistent bans on them. There's a lot of things they could do with it. I think since they don't want it to take up too much time, I bet they won't introduce a ban system. But I do think that it's kind of a quick and dirty way to fix the problem is to is just to equalize whatever the
Or at
RNG
least
is.
like address it. I definitely hear you. I also think that like you've had first-hand experience both in this mode and campaign and saw the recent changes, and I wanted to get a piece of your mind on that. So, campaign right now you can retry, and they significantly nerf the difficulty. And you've been a minimum power guy before, and I bet you'll be a minimum power guy now. So, how do you feel like, in retrospect, what are some things that people didn't understand at first, and now we see a lot? Because, and I'll give you context, in my other video, I actually said that now stargazing is significantly better than it was when you compare it to 4 faction, at least better than it used to be. So, how do you feel about some of the heroes there? How do you feel about strategy there? And how do you feel about this change in general?
So, in order to unpack that, let me start with your second question, which is pretty much, if stargazing, how good is stargazing now? And and I agree with you that what the prescription was to stargaze early actually was the correct prescription. And those players who did that ended up with a severe advantage. While I would say that, and I'll explain why, while I would say that, 4 faction is clearly the way to go to develop, as a newer players, to develop the hero cores that are most useful in campaign and in other modes. Those players who have already stargazed for your Talines and all kinds of amazing heroes are at a severe advantage for the long term against anyone who has 4 faction. The reason being, their optimal play right now would be to build 4 faction, which puts months onto basically the price tag of any Celepogian. So Celepogians are still best in slot. So there's actually a huge advantage to already having those heroes, but the prescription for newer players is what's changed.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand you right, you're saying, okay, you want, like in the end game, end all be all, you probably want Celepogians. And the reason is probably consistency. Some stages for faction heroes will struggle with. For example, there's some stages that Gwyneth really, really hates. Obviously, some of them less much so, especially since the nerfs. But there's still going to be stages where you will want Celepogians. And once you'll want Celepogians, the amount of work you'll have to put in is so significant that if you've already gotten them, you're at a point of severe advantage. And unlike those players who focused 4 faction from the start and are just now catching on to the fact that, for example, to play PvP or have a very consistent comp for KT or something like that, they'll need to start stargazing.
Right. And I'll say that there is exception made for LC specifically. Granted, it's almost a whale-only event. But what I will say is that there is an open question over whether PvP leading up to that, like let's say you go for Zolrath, which you pretty much need. After that, it may end up turning out that 4 faction is the best next until you start to get a full team.
Oh, so you're saying if I'm from a developmental standpoint, like if I want to run in LC in chapter 33, I'm probably not trying to get any first placements or anything on any old server. But if I'm trying to run against someone after I've grabbed like Zorath, who's obviously the king with his furniture, maybe, just maybe, there's 4 faction heroes that are easier to get and would put up a better comp. And I can definitely see that. Like in my mind, like the old burst comp would be the perfect example of that, because there you have Zorath, and then you have 4 factions. You have Lorsand, you have Gwyneth, you have Aaron, and who's the last there? Leica, right? Mm-hmm.
Right.
So definitely agreed. Have you ever made any big PvP achievements?
So my alt account, which I probably should stop calling that, my second account has made it through the group stage, and of course, 1 loss is almost the rule, not the exception. But I haven't made it into the actual tournament yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in, 4th.
Oh man, like I feel like this is getting crueler and crueler as time goes on, because in the older regions, you see that many players that were really strong in the past just get stronger. It's kind of a Price's Law kind of thing, where all the power goes the same place, and eventually you end up seeing the same faces. So for me, I think I'm on a short timer to reach round of 4, and if I don't reach round of 4 within the next, like a year or something, then the players that are going to run against me are just going to be such high spenders. And then in the nearer servers, it's even worse, because you still have the same whales because whales keep joining over time. But and not only that, they also like end up like these are whales that know strategy, because if you look at the nearest servers, obviously if you look at the how much do they know about the game, it's so much more than we had. Like I built Chimera like way back. Like people laugh at me now.
Oh yeah.
Like
the classic.
Exactly. And I had Almo in the podcast. Have you seen the podcast we had with Almo? So that's really funny. He was talking about God Comp, and you showed me this awesome example of a God Comp. Do you want to talk about it?
Sure. So the God Comp that I made on the second account replaces Talene and the whatever CC you pick, Tassie, with Isold and Odin. And alternatively, on defense, Hendrik works pretty well in frontline Odin's slot. So the basic gist is, of course, that's going to be really strong against other God Comps in a mirror comp, because Isold's getting stacks of damage reduction and attack while they spam their abilities. And you also have Aziz, who is going to be eventually locking them down and hopefully opening the window. But I've won without gaining any window, because Isold, of course, as he takes damage, he's basically in a race against Talene's shield. So it's a war of attrition, but if I get ults, then it's pretty much over.
That's incredible. I'm just looking at some of the replay here, and it's really, really interesting, because you see level 57 sustenance tree, that's way higher than anything you have. It's like 20s and 30s, I see it highest for you. Unless I see the celerity wrong. What's celerity at?
My celerity? On this one is 55, okay. And there's no celerity hero.
But there are indeed no celerity heroes. So we see like significantly lower tree levels. We see less investment on the God Comp heroes. So yours is, for example, plus 20, plus 3. The enemy is plus 30, plus 3. We see the same with twins. They also have a couple of stars. And you still, with those 4 faction heroes like Isold and Odin, managed to actually do this. Like, did you target the buff from Odin into Isold? Is that a part of it?
So, yes, he's the highest power, so it'll always go to him. And then Odin builds energy incredibly fast. So usually I get the first ult and snowball from there, but there's the backup redundancy. And this player is, 29 levels above me. And so it's
that's going to be hard to see.
It's a pretty steep disadvantage. And of course, it's not a consistent win against
how consistent are we talking?
If I'm attacking him with this team, it's 50-50.
50-50. I would say that's pretty consistent. I don't know many teams that can go up against PvP God Comp again at this deficit and pull up 50-50.
Well, it's something that works for, when you're able to pick who you're going to fight. But obviously, if I pick this comp into a burst comp, for example, Odin's not going to live very long. So you get some pretty difficult. But actually, with Hendrik, it's not bad at all. It's surprisingly tanky.
Hendrik. And Hendrik Furnish is one thing I personally really like too, also from the event. I think you have awesome insight into stuff that's off the meta that people don't use a lot. And I really want to get to talk about your course. But one thing that I do before that is I want to hear from you. Like, all right, there's many people listening. They're about chapter 20. They're chapter 15. I've done a poll recently. It's actually amazing to me. And they don't know exactly what to build because they hear all these different voices. They hear what I say. You hear what you say, you hear what people that are less credible say, and they're confused. And I want you to just walk me through what do you think should players aim for at each state of the campaign. So let's say I'm starting from chapter 1 or 10, wherever you feel comfortable, all the way up to like 33, 34, which you recently broke through. What do you think at each stage should be the focus, and what are some heroes that people should be attentive to?
Sure. So one of the things that I hope to develop is a sort of wish list guide. I tend to think of it in terms of phases where the outset, no matter what you're doing, it's a good idea to have mostly core heroes, which are basically ones that you can put together to make good teams. Obviously, because if you start with your favorite hero, right, you may actually just get more frustrated. You can build a favorite hero eventually. But it's a good idea to learn the game, first of all, see why the heroes that are good, why they're good, unless you're someone that, you're just one of the few that wants to try something different from the beginning, and that's your style. So kind of figuring out your style is probably step 1. And then for most paths, the opening phase is just focus on some core heroes. The second one I would call kind of a flex stage, where you all of a sudden now you know what the game has given you. It doesn't matter what you went for. Now you have to build around what the game's given you. And some of the heroes that you would have put up that you would have considered to be core are now being removed for heroes that synergize with what you actually got. That I can't really put a chapter to that because it's completely relative to what you get. If you get a whole bunch of daemons, then you can swing entirely to make a killer daemon team and milk it until multi-battles very easily. And then you're just focusing on power. And then finally, I would call the end phase the flavor stage, where you build what you want because you're where you want to be. You know, if you're probably going to be power capped. And I didn't answer this question earlier, but the changes to campaign, and of course it's new into the second campaign nerf, probably means that most players that are familiar enough with the game are going to be power capped. And that may be complained about a lot, but there's not too much better alternatives. I think that the change was to smooth the difficulty curve, so it doesn't feel like you hit this giant wall at 31 and then a new one, every time they add a fight. So I think it was the smart thing to do, but at the same time, I feel for people that spent hours on content that now people can do, in one sitting.
That's a good topic. That's one thing that's been hard for me personally, because I'm thinking, all right, so you'll always have the players who do the macros to throw their head against the wall, do the 1 million retries, just go all the way for it. And with one change, they essentially cut down macros significantly, because if the old macros that you used to do, like they had 5% on each set, then you have to do 5% followed by 5% sequentially. And now it's like significantly less. Like instead of 1 in 3 million, it's like 1 in 100. So all these inconsistent sets, like you bring people, you push them towards the minimum power. And then they give the extra push of nerfing campaign back. And I look at it and I say, okay, this is essentially really pushing people into the land of min power, even if they're not mad retrying everything like Athene, like all these people. So why do that? Why not let people who want to be stuck strategically, who want to pull up those sets that will have to be 10% consistent, otherwise it'll be too much, why not let them be stuck strategically instead of by a cruel game mechanic? It's just like, okay, you're forced to stop. And obviously I'm playing devil's advocate. I get what's good about that. But what do you say to the part that's bad?
So I would say that it has to do with them selecting an intelligent power cap. In a way, the power cap's necessary because all it takes is one bug that they let through, and people can get well ahead of everyone else while that bug is there. Then they have to make the much harder decision whether or not to roll back a server or do something like that, which is the last thing they ever want to do. So that the power cap is almost like saying if they select it intelligently, we don't want you to be able to go higher than this at a certain level of development. And that's not a terrible thing to do so long as they pick the right one. And right now that they've nerfed campaign, people will feel artificially limited by that. So I do think they need to make it at least, something like 4 times power. Let people beat their head on the wall if they want to. Some people want that challenge, and others, it won't make a difference. They'll wait until they can beat it somewhat easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That sounds fair. That sounds fair. Well, I really want to approach the one topic that I feel like has the most immediate relevance to people. So let's just quickly pull this up. All right, Aimb, and why won't you tell us what we're looking at over here?
So what I made was 3 visuals that each contain 2 sets of hero cores. The reason it's divided like that is somewhat just in order to convey the kinds of teams that you're building and how they're kind of certain factions. So, for example, the 5-core and invasion core, if you notice, these 2 comps are divided by their win condition. One of them is pulling the enemy to your side, and one of them you're invading the enemy side. And what this is based around is the idea that it's better to talk about win conditions than about heroes individually. Rowan, amazing hero, but what does he do for a win condition? And better than teams, because you can't really communicate much just by describing here are the 5 heroes that I have in the team, because there's a lot of complexity when switching out any individual hero, any other synergies in and out. So what I kind of want to do with this is to change how people talk about AFKArena, at least add to it, where people think about how their team's supposed to win and how to build around that after they've developed a core. So the idea is, wish lists serve the purpose of getting cores first, then flex heroes that hopefully can flex to the cores you've developed. But these aren't meant to be set in stone or anything like that. For instance, the Sophia, or Sophia, however you want to pronounce it, is one that a lot of people don't use with 5 pool, especially once you get Orthos and that kind of hero. So what I would describe these cores as is the most stable of the selections. And these all 6 of these teams are made in with each other in mind. In other words, there's only maybe 1 or 2 heroes repeating, and they're only as flex, so that they can go between teams.
So let me see if I get this correctly. The idea basically is to teach people 2 things. First of all, what kind of synergies work in the very end game, some ideas rather than specific heroes that they can use to employ strategies that work across different stages. And the second one is to kind of convey what heroes could you prioritize when you pull. So for example, let's say I already have Tatus, I have Scrag, and I have an Athalia, and I have a Citrana. So maybe Anarchy for me is more valuable than Anarchy for another guy. Like kind of understanding when would you like to prioritize a certain hero.
Right. And how are they going to fit into the team, which is one of the reasons. Like now, if you look kind of at the icons represent the ones closest to, like the lightning bolt on the Iron side is meant to represent burst, and the target on the Titus side is meant to represent smart targeting. Basically, they're 2 entirely different strategies employed in order to take down the enemy, which is why Scrag, of course, protects Titus, while actually both he and what's her name, Citrana, are actually very beefy tanks. Citrana for different reasons. And you basically supplement that team with heroes that both do something on the enemy side and either save Titus or help him burst, because his smart targeting starts at 50%. So, for instance, Lorsan. Lorsan is one of the best synergies with Titus because you need him to become tanky very quickly. And that, in effect, does that virtually for free.
That's interesting. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I get exactly what you mean. Let's look at another one of those cores.
Okay.
All right, so I see you've made a couple of these. This is actually really beautiful. Like I could definitely see a book with a legend explaining all these icons. Why won't you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing here with the sustain core and the save core?
Sure. So the basic difference is kind of in the names. You have Damon, who has to ult multiple times, and that's actually his win condition, is to stay alive, ult, build attack, get larger shields, and then keep that shield in order to keep the high sustained damage. So it's about kind of protecting him for long enough. The save core is almost entirely different. Abyssal really doesn't need to continue to ult. He will, but that's not actually his win condition. His win condition is once he ults and gets the kill, typically speaking, he's tanky enough, and he will always ult before he gets out of it, unless there's energy drain. So it's one of the ways I want to separate it conceptually is just why these heroes are used with them. So, for instance, Hendrik is a save, obviously. So is Silas. And all you need is to get Abyssal to ult. One of the biggest game changers for any save core, especially for Abyssal, was Barricade. And I mean, huge. I stick in a Grez with Barricade, and he can, just as long as he isn't burst first, then he's a full save on Abyssal, even if it's just save 1 hit. And Abyssal taking damage, allowing him to take damage and not die, means he will be his own damage to kill, thereby fulfilling his win. It's actually an incredibly consistent comp, and it can be heroes can be moved around very easily.
That's interesting because I look at these comps and none of these are exactly meta, but the way you look at it, I think is the best. So first of all, these are all comps you've been successful with in the past, right? Or at least tested to some extent.
Right. Actually, plenty of plenty of experience with these.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things definitely Cloud does a lot is a lot of emphasis on testing different heroes, not just you. Like Shazam tells me all kinds of things he does in our the podcast we had. I also see here that you really try to, as you said, like give each hero a spotlight. So the idea here is that this could potentially probably expand into even more sets, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, the purpose of this I should bring up is that it's not just my way of communicating my thoughts. One of the things that I would love to happen is for other guide makers and players to kind of latch on to this kind of visual, because you can communicate a lot more this way without having to use a lot of words that a lot of people won't even read. They may not even take it too seriously if it's nothing but words explaining 5 heroes. So I want it to kind of enable, let's say Shay decides to make one with an entendre core. So it wouldn't have to be split into 2 sides. Shay would have, entendre in the middle and show what heroes and what comps could be used with that specific hero. It's meant to get people to talk about hero cores, but you can talk about heroes in terms of cores as
like
well.
Like an AFK encyclopedia, if you will.
Right. It's meant to convey a lot of information quickly and hopefully clearly enough for any given player. So if I'm a new player and I look at this, it's probably a jumble, first of all. But if all they need to know is that on one side is a team comp and that these heroes fit well together, they have enough information just from the visual to know that those go together. But there's also more information in order to convey more information about these cores and comps.
I see. And if I look at the next one, I'm looking at the Portal core and the Wilder core. I love these. I think these convey synergy in a way we've never seen before. So I'm seeing also the Portal core and the Wilder core here. These are pretty interesting. So saying this one, you didn't take one hero. There's the Pipa and the Odin. They're kind of interchangeable. What's that about?
So Portal core is the one unique core. And of course, right now, I haven't seen it. We needed 6 teams. So this is the 6th team, in part because if you have these 2 heroes together, what they synergize to do is cluster heroes. And so you have most of these heroes, the heroes that are carries, the ones with the green arrows, I guess you'd call them. Those are heroes that could be a carry for a Portal core, mainly because they capitalize on enemy clustering. So the idea with Portal core, and the neat thing is, you could have these heroes on your wish list and make something out of any of them. It's basically a wish list filler that can then be changed depending on what you get. And what I would say is you need at least, of course, 1 copy of Pippa and Odin in order to make it work, and which is very low. And they can very quickly, the way the 2 heroes work together, if you put Pippa slot 4 and Odin anywhere he isn't instantly killed, they immediately teleport the front 2 heroes to the back line somewhere on the same slot typically. So there's lots of clustering that you can do with that, and then capitalize, say Gwen, you just need tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So there really is, it's kind of an untapped combo, because you can also use Windbinder on Odin, which changes its targeting. You can teleport your own heroes, make them immune to damage. So this is, I mean, I've done a lot of experimenting with it, and there's tons of cool things that you can do, but I've only scratched the surface.
I love it. And there's obviously so much more. Like just thinking, okay, maybe you put Skriath in there. Maybe you could do a whole section about counters, what works great into what. I love this idea a lot. All right, let's carry on to another incredible composition that you've made that I don't see many people use. This one, I think I can guess what's the idea here with the Twins Unity. But why won't you share it what this is playing?
Sure. So the main synergy here, as you pointed out, is Twins linking, what's his name? Torn and Mezov. The two of them actually are, it's almost like a seesaw of power, where Mezov is the strongest at the very beginning of the fight, while Torn has to build. They both have defensive buffs, and as one goes down, one goes up, basically. The Twins link basically covers the weakness, the individual weakness of the two, and eventually Torn will of course, win if he's left alive. And then on top of that, Rowan, which is, of course, a hero that's highly coveted by any team, really synergizes with their giant health pool, and Torn gets to an insane health pool and becomes almost impossible to kill.
Oh man, I love that. Have you cooperated with some players like Clint My Whip and others that we've seen to see some of those heroes? Or are most of these your ideas alone? Do you work with other people when you discover these kinds of ideas?
So what was really cool is that with Whip, he was on the exact same track. So we discussed heroes like um, Torn and Oscar, and he had them in development at the same time as I did, and it was pretty funny how much crossover there was. So while it wasn't collaborative, I mean, he's as much the inventor of this kind of comp as I am. And I mean, Odin, Torn, and Oscar were all specifically focused on for this account for me and for his account.
That's awesome. That's awesome the way that you guys collaborate. And let's talk just a little bit more about the kind of environments that this comes to, because you guys don't know. There's just an endless sea of Aimb replays that are nothing like what you used to the meta, and he does things in minimum power that I have never seen anyone do that way before. It's really, really amazing the level of knowledge you have of especially those niche heroes and what you're able to put together. I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you're in Cloud9. Are you a deputy? You're not. But you definitely see the high level events that go on. Very strategic guild, obviously. Shazam organized a lot of things there too. Almo is also a deputy in Cloud9, I think, right? Right.
Yes.
So it's coming again. Abyssal Expedition is coming in 4 days, and many players are very frustrated with this style of gaming where it just pushes onto them so much activity that they need to do, and a lot of people are getting fatigued. And I wanted to hear, what would you tell a fatigued player? How would you summarize the event shortly, and what do you think about this in general? So that new players that approach it now just kind of know what to do and where to stand.
So newer players for Abyssal?
Abyssal.
Or burned out players for Abyssal.
I mean, this Abyssal, because it's going to be my understanding is it's going to be an iteration of the one we just had with minor changes that they described and described in the patch notes. So, the premise is basically the same. The plan is basically the same. But a lot of people, first of all, they don't know what's the optimal strategy, and second, they're feeling very fatigued and they want to hear a general overview of the event or what you think about it.
I see. So I would say with this Abyssal, I could see people wanting to treat it seriously. Competitive guilds crave competitive content and, are more than welcome to it. What I would say is that for those of us, myself included, who are not burned out from that content, but rather having it too quickly and this close to holidays, I would say, it's worth doing if everyone is okay with everyone else taking it somewhat easy. You want to make sure that everyone gets prints. And so I would kind of hope that, the most competitive guilds aren't going to take it seriously. But rather, compete within knowing that no one's going to try hard. It's more like a strategy than an effort kind of thing. I would say I hope everyone's okay not going hard sometimes, because otherwise we're just at the mercy of however quickly they release content, which we crave and then we don't like. So overall, I'm encouraged by the pace of the content, the amount that they come out with, but Abyssal specifically is so time intensive. So, that's for the most part, I think everyone's just trying to find their balance with the game, which is 70 players in a guild that coordinate. That's hard to balance.
I definitely hear you. I think that's an interesting take where you say, all right, even if you're a high competing guild, even if we're all the way up there, maybe you can take it a little bit easier. I hear you. And I've been hearing these vibes. I'm in many different guild Discords and I look around. I've been hearing these vibes to, instead of compete all the way, just calm down, not fatigue yourself, enjoy the game in the end of things, because this is the goal of it. It's definitely what I do.
Pick your fights.
Definitely. But let's say you're a newer player, one of those that struggled to get prints in the last one due to boss damage or limitations like that. What would you recommend a new player do to ensure that they reach prints without much effort, especially considering the format it's in right now?
So I know they nerfed it a little bit, but I think it was something in the 20% health range nerf. I would say, if you struggled before, then the first thing to do is to try to get as good a group as you can get without leaving anyone high and dry. But on top of that, if you have to settle for less than Prince, then it's not really that big of a deal. I mean, it may be to players that really want it, but in the end, it's not worth breaking your back over. 3K gems is a lot. It's also a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's not worth getting salty.
I'll make it concrete though. Let's say you're talking with the competitive of most competitive players, because that's most of my audience is somewhat competitive, and they get the mind state. They don't live or die by that, but they really want to get to Prince. And last match, like I've heard some people, they don't know what's the best way to get the right boss damage. So what tree do you think, for example, would be something that's good, or what heroes do you think is something that's good, or what kind of strategy early into the event would lead the player to get to the position where they can pretty safely claim at the very least their Prince title?
So I think it's pretty safe to say that most people like their celerity. It's easy to build. People have the heroes, and so one of the ways to make sure that that doesn't translate into just killing Ains, too quickly and then costing everyone Prince is to switch when you think it's time, because you can actually at some point it actually hurts to do more damage to Ains. So in the end, it's just having the kinds of comps that deal damage to Albedo so that you can make up for anyone being overzealous.
All right. So as leader, there may be some sort of coordination between how many people shift from celerity to sorcery, maybe, or something along these lines. And another hidden piece of advice there is that obviously celerity is the easiest tree to branch with. So quick advice would be pick celerity, just go easy in the first few days. You'll probably be fine. When later, as long as you communicate about beating the bosses, you'll be okay. That's as long as you don't beat one of them. The other has half health, and now they're enraged Albedo or enraged Ains, which is even both of these are terrible. Yeah, right. And I want the last thing I really want to hear from you is what are some of the biggest mistakes you feel newer players make? Because you definitely have the approach to min-max things. You have a different outlook on it. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I would say newer players, let's say a player that is getting into it and is planning on being competitive with their very first account. I think the main pitfall, at least the one that comes to mind, actually, let me think of that. Okay, yeah. I figured out a way to phrase it. So for newer players, I would say the main pitfall they can fall into is that they don't adapt to what they get from RNG. So a lot of players want to know what the best wish list looks like, and I'm not sure that anyone knows exactly what that's going to be, or at least able to communicate it in a way that any given player will use it the way that the person that made it plans to. I think that wish list is meant to be flexible, such that when you get the heroes that you need, that are good, having one hyper carry, and then building around that carry is much better than to have a group of best heroes. There really isn't that. There are a few that are hyper carries. Go for those. But after that, try experimenting instead of just copying. That to me is invaluable, because you'll always ask the same questions if it's just a matter of copying. The next hero to build, the next SI to go. Some of it's experimenting, and some of it is continuing to ask, because this community is one of the best in terms of willingness to discuss and even to talk about the contingencies. What else do you have? They ask questions back.
I love that. So I think on that note, Aimb, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I'm very happy that we got to hear all this kind of wisdom. Definitely a perspective that we don't hear from many players. And thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much, Luker.
All right. Okay. I think we did it. Oh man, the final advice was so good. Like telling people that context is the thing. and that getting like, oh my god, tier list, wish list, all of that is just, it's so messy. It's so messy. It's like, I think it's like the biggest thing. I think this is why you putting out the whole idea with cores and synergies is like the right approach to it.
Yeah.